Today, I have an anthropologist named Stephen Johnson who's going to talk about the little people and interdimensional travel. The background of this video is me exploring for little people during the blood moon. Okay, so you want to give a brief introduction on yourself, a little bit of your education and background and everything?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Stefan Johnson, and uh, my background, to put it, well, to sum it up pretty quickly, um, I'm an artist, I'm a chef, but I was also trained in anthropology. I received my master's in anthropology from Michigan State University. So, uh,
Oh, awesome. And what got you interested in anthropology?
well, uh, actually, I started out when I went back to school in wildlife biology. I was actually in the College of Natural Resources. But then I was taking a course in American Indian philosophies. It was an elective course because we had a choice to take an elective. And I ended up taking that course and decided after that course had gone on for a while that this was something that I really wanted to get into. And I decided to switch my major right then and there. And under advisement from a couple counselors, it was suggested that I do a double major in anthropology and American Indian studies. Um, but as to why American Indian studies became such a topic, that I wanted to study, something that interested me so much, that story stretches back actually a number of years back into my childhood, which could get into a fairly long story if you want to hear that stuff or not. It's up to you. But that could take up quite a bit of time.
And what got you interested in the like little people or the paranormal type stuff?
Well, all my life I've been interested in the paranormal, or what would be, considered the paranormal. Um, as a kid growing up, I was always fascinated by ghost stories and things like that. But then, in my college career, when I got involved pretty heavily in American Indian studies, um, I actually started to get involved in ceremony through one of my professors who was a Ojibwe or is a Ojibwe, and he is also Medewan. Um, and during the course of taking one of his classes, which was on Ojibwe culture and history, um, one thing in particular was that he invited students from his class to actually come up to his reserve in Canada to experience and learn about the sweat lodge ceremony. And so, being a student, and I really liked his class, and I, wanted to learn about, these things that I'd been reading about but didn't know much about, I decided to go and participate in Canada, in Ontario, in the River District, um, at his reserve in a sweat lodge ceremony where he taught us, like, basically, pretty much all of the tenets of the ceremony, what the ceremony is, how it works, how it functions, and then we actually participated. Um, so once the sweat lodge experience took place, was basically sort of my first introduction to witnessing things that I couldn't necessarily explain from a scientific point of view. Um, so from that point on, I became fairly heavily involved in sweat lodge ceremonies because once we got back down to Minneapolis, there was a sweat lodge that was going on in Minneapolis as well, and that he was a part of, and we could go to a sweat lodge every other week. So I continued going to sweat lodges and trying to, experience more, learn more. But to put it simply, I had a vision in my first sweat lodge. And once I had the first vision, I was like, okay, this is definitely something. This isn't just, a bunch of stuff people talk about. This is actually real, and sort of piqued my interest into trying to figure out what was actually happening. The second part of how the little people comes into it was that in that same professor's class, we actually did a unit on rock paintings. And most of my knowledge about little people actually comes from rock paintings, which ended up actually becoming my entire course of study. So when I went after undergraduate studies and went into graduate school, I focused specifically on rock paintings. And rock paintings, there's at least, there's one particular marking on the rocks in these rock paintings that actually specifically has to do with the little people, or as in the region of the Great Lakes and the Canadian Shield, many of the people, the groups of people associated with the rock paintings from the Anishinaabe culture, they talk about this particular painting as having to do with the little people in specific. So what this print, or what this image is of a handprint. And when you see a handprint on the rocks as a rock painting, what that tends to indicate is that is actually an exit mark for where medicine men went into the rocks where the little people live, so that they could exchange for medicine, like knowledge of different medicines, with the little people, and then they exited out of the rocks. And when they exited out of the rocks where the little people live, they left a handprint, and that is the exit mark. And so that was sort of my introduction into the topic of little people.
So, did anyone tell you about how they could live in rocks like that, or explain that to you?
Well, okay, from the anthropological perspective, things get kind of strange there, because when you get into anthropology and anthropological study on an academic level, one of the things they first try to indoctrinate you with in your course of study is something called not going native. They try and warn you against this practice, that as a sociocultural anthropologist, which is what I am, basically trying to look at groups, the social groups that people have, and, sort of basically look at what makes people tick, why they do the things that they do to begin with. And that involves anything that groups of people are involved with. So, but to go native in the anthropological sense that you're warned against in your early training is to not accept, what the group of people is that you're working with have told you as to what these things are. So basically, like, anytime you encounter situations where a group of people are expressing that there's some form of magic involved, something unexplainable, something paranormal, you're sort of not supposed to fall into the belief that that actually exists. You're supposed to separate yourself, looking objectively at the information and collecting information about this group of people. What the problem ends up being is, depending on what you're doing, there's actually many instances where anthropologists do, quote unquote, go native. And they actually then start to realize that things that are happening amongst the groups of people that they're working with are actually happening because they witnessed them themselves. So, I don't know, does that sort of help? Go on.
they kind of train you to not believe what they say and try to dismiss the paranormal aspect or the supernatural aspect and just take the Western view instead.
Yeah, that's what they try to train you to do. And, from their perspective, it makes sense, but at the same time, once you start working with a group of people and you start working with a group of people closely, then you start to realize that things are not quite as black and white as all of that. And something that happened, at least with me, was that I was starting to get into texts where people were ultimately then questioning their skepticism about a group of people, and the magic that they had witnessed, the quote unquote magic or paranormal event, where anthropologists went in with a specific idea saying, these things aren't real. This is just something that they've come up with, this folklore and things of that nature. But then actually witness the events that the people were saying take place, and then ended up like their entire career not being able to actually come to any conclusion as to what they had seen, you know. And so that type of information starts to pique my interest as well. Um, but as to what anthropology says, about rock paintings, at least the accepted wisdom, has been for a large portion of time that, almost to the effect that rock paintings are actually just graffiti. And, that it's hard to say that there's any significance to them whatsoever, culturally speaking. It's like, yes, people painted these, but as to why people painted them in the first place is a huge question. But from my own research into, the cultures that I was dealing with, that was not the actual information that was being, given out through oral traditions or just, you know, someone, a native person speaking about these particular things. And even through my own research, where I went into the region to actually look into some of these topics, the idea that they were just graffiti was not actually adhered to by the actual people. And so became more enticing to start to dig deeper than what the anthropological traditions, want people to think about rock paintings. Where there's a lot of information about rock paintings out there, but the information about it is very dry, very analytical, and actually doesn't really speak to anything as to what these might be in a larger context.
So, what do you
If that
think?
makes sense.
What do you think about the idea of things being able to go in and out through rocks? Like, do you have any theories on that or ideas on that?
Okay. I do. I do have some ideas on how things might be able to pass into or through things that we would consider to be solid objects. Um, anthropology comes from a semi hard scientific view of things, but many times they don't actually account for other scientific evidence that actually exists out there in the world. So, in my own personal interests, I am also interested in, the ideas behind theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, things of that nature, which then start to break down to the atomic level how our universe is actually constructed. And so when you start getting into some of that information, you start to realize that, in fact, theoretically speaking, we could all actually pass through solid objects. The only reason that we're not able to pass through solid objects, at least in a normal situation, is because, well, say a solid object like a rock, its atoms, its atomic structure is moving at such a slow rate, um, that we are not able to pass through that object. But theoretically speaking, you actually could move through that object if the right conditions were in place. And so what some of those conditions that need to happen for you to actually pass through something like a rock has to do with frequencies. And frequencies, well, I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain this. So everything that exists in the universe exists on a frequency. You and I exist on a frequency, down to our atomic structure. When you get into the particles that make us up on the atomic level, everything is held together by energy, which has its own frequency. So, almost like a radio signal has a frequency, it's a waveform, right? But when you get down to the atomic structure and the things that bind you together and all of your atoms and all the elements that hold you together as a person, it comes down to something, you get into valence shells. And valence shells are the way that the particles in the atomic structure move around each other and hold each other together. They are all held together by a charge, positive, negative, so on and so forth. But those charges are what holds everything together. So you then necessarily get into the concept of frequencies. And so if everything exists on its own frequency, down to the atomic level, then theoretically speaking, if you could manipulate those frequencies, or you could shift them in such a way that would make it possible for you to actually pass through something that we would consider to be a solid object, which in all reality, nothing is actually a solid object. It's just how fast their atomic structure is moving and those elements are being held together. What got me interested in that concept was actually something that happened before I went to school. I actually started school late. I didn't go back to university until I was 28 years old. So I'd started to come up with at least some ideas of things, dealing with this prior to. So something that ignited my curiosity and frequency and, getting down to the atomic level of how things function, is that I came across an album by a particular group, and the album is called Time Machines. And the album actually is not in any way, shape, or form something like you would consider a musical album by a popular band. It doesn't have songs, so to speak. What it has is 4 particular frequencies. And on this album, each frequency is paired up with a card with images of symbols, which are then on fields of color. So what you have is a symbol of a primary color on a field of a secondary color to then contrast it. And each of these cards is then associated with a particular frequency. And what you are supposed to do, the instructions for this particular album, is for each frequency then you are supposed to meditate on each card. And so by doing this, the theory is that if you can manipulate frequencies, you could open up a portal for your mind to be able to travel through time, okay? Which goes back to some ideas in Freemasonry and the occult school of Freemasonry, which talks about being able to travel through time with your mind and being able to witness the past and the future and basically dictate where you go and witness events as they took place, right? And not actually, physically being there, but your brain is able to manipulate, these frequencies to then have access to things and witness things in the past and the present and the future. So what my experience ended up being with this album is I had a friend of mine at the time who was a professor of astral projection, and he taught courses in this at university, and I was friends with him just by association, and I had found this album and I decided, hey, I'm going to try this out. And so I wanted to see if there was anything to this, because just by nature, as a person, I'm a skeptic. Unless I can actually see something taking place or, perceive it myself, I'm going to question it pretty heavily. So I talked to him about the album, brought him to my house, and I said, let's do this. Let's see if this is actually a thing, if any of this actually works. So we did. We actually proceeded to put the cards down on the floor, meditate to each of the cards, to each of the frequencies. And the experience that occurred once we got to the fourth card was something I will never forget. It sort of changed my whole, perception of reality, so to speak. So once you got to the fourth card in the process of meditation on these frequencies, imagine you take a giant rock and you drop it in like a pool of water or like a pond or something, and you have ripples that come out from that rock. I mean, that's just standard. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have ripples coming out. Well, from this fourth card, by the time we got to the fourth and final frequency and the fourth card in the sequence, and we're meditating on it, what that card turned into was as if you had thrown a rock into the floor, except as if that floor was actually now liquid and was actually rippling out in large ripples from that card, except the floor that that card was on was a hardwood floor. So imagine you're watching the hardwood floor turning into ripples coming out from that rock, or from that card continuously, not stopping. And then those ripples and that hardwood floor actually turning into the spectrum colors of the rainbow. I hope I haven't lost you on that one.
Okay, so
Does that make any sense?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So describe the process of frequencies in terms of meditation and what exactly you did for the meditation. Like you're just saying frequencies, but like how did you do it with meditation? You know what I mean? Like describe it a little better.
Okay. So the meditation process on each card. So what we did is we stared at each card. All right. So for the first card, for the first frequency, we just basically sat there, stared, cleared our minds, and just meditated on that card while listening to the frequency. Okay. And so you did the same thing for each frequency and each successive card until you got through the four frequencies and to the fourth card. So it was actually a very simplistic process. It wasn't, anything, there wasn't anything very conscious actually going on. The idea was to actually empty your mind of anything at all, and to clear your brain pathways so that you weren't actually thinking about anything, while you were staring at the card and listening to the frequency. So then you have the auditory, a visual, but at the same time trying to maintain like a clear, brain pathway so that you're not distracted by other thoughts. And so for me, at least what I did was that I just focused on the card. I just stared at the card and that was it. And it just didn't think about anything else. And during the process, your mind becomes clearer and clearer and clearer to the point where you don't have anything left that you're thinking about in your head, and all you're concentrating on is the card and listening to the frequency. The frequency is actually becomes more like a background noise, almost like assisting in the meditation process to help clear your mind, right? Does that help describe the process a little bit better?
Do you think the physical sound of the frequencies from the radio or whatever, do you think that had anything to do with the card's ability to fall through the floor, or was it just focusing on it? Like, what do you think triggered that effect?
Well, what I think triggered it, I think it was the combination of the meditation process and the frequencies that we exist on Then you had another frequency that was added to the equation that I think was actually um, counteracting the normal frequencies that we exist on. And I think that that frequency was then what helped manipulate the situation, where the card ended up being an aid because of the way it was, composed. Each card being a symbol with secondary and primary colors to contrast on each other, right? Almost like a visual like illusion. If you've ever seen any of those things, they very frequently show up, pop up on Facebook, like, here, test your eyes. What can you see in this image? But not something so confusing enough that you're actually, you know, where you get dizzy, like looking at an image, trying to find another image. Do you see what I'm saying?
Do you
Does that make
think
sense?
do you think you could recreate that experiment and make it happen again?
Do you think I could repeat that experiment?
Yeah, repeat it, like
Is
recreate
that what
that,
you asked?
repeat the like
I do
recreate that
think
whole
so.
thing, because if we can understand the process like more clearly, like what state of mind you have to be in, why is like how does your mind change from frequency to frequency in order to achieve that state, or
Hmm.
you know what I mean, like um, because if it's that simple to travel through solid mass, because I hear a lot of paranormal stories about reptilians and grays
Yeah.
and Bigfoot and little people being able to walk through walls exactly like you described, like a ripple of water, like the wall turns into water, they just walk right through it, and then it turns back to solid right when they go
Yeah.
through. And I want to kind of understand a little more about, you've done the experiment. You and this guy were able to make a card pass through a solid object like it was water. So you know better than anybody, like what subtle processes or what creates that type of effect on matter.
Yeah. Um, I guess what I would have to say is yes, you could absolutely recreate this process or this experiment again. It's reproducible. The group of musicians that actually did this is actually one of their things. The group's name is Coil, by the way, just Coil. And this was one of their experiments that they did. And then they put it out as an album so that people could actually do this for themselves. Now, there is a caveat to this too. So, the instructions for doing this experiment is that there is actually under each frequency, there is a list of the chemical names of hallucinogenic compound combinations that you are actually supposed to take while you for each frequency. Okay. And so it gets successively more and more intense for each frequency and different chemical combinations that you are supposed to ingest to assist you with this process. And the reason that I say that this is actually a reproducible experience is because me and the guy that did this, the professor of astral projection, we were not partaking in any of the hallucinogenics. We did this all and experienced this completely without the aid of the hallucinogenics that were required. A, because they would be difficult to get a hold of. B, they're illegal. And C, we wanted to sort of test it for ourselves to see if it was anything at all, if it was worth even like thinking about. And so in the end, we ended up doing this experiment without the aid and taking out one like very important element of the process and doing it without that. And I imagine that if you were to follow the instructions completely and to actually obtain these chemical compounds, then the process would actually become much more intense. And the idea of traveling through time is that you would actually do so. But when we were done with the process, and we had done this without the aid of the hallucinogenics that were supposed to be part of it, I was very much a novice at the time at anything of this type or experimenting with this type of thing at all. And so I looked to my colleague, who is the professor of astral projection, to ask him what he thought of what was going on once we were finished. And what I'm going to say, and I hope this doesn't become a problem for censorship or anything of that nature, but I quote him as saying, "These guys aren't fucking around." And that was pretty much the conclusion of that experiment. But if anybody was to do this experiment on their own, I believe that it is definitely reproducible. And it's
Damn.
something that some people would have to do on their own for sure.
Damn. Do you still practice meditation?
Um, Not in that sense, because that was many years prior to when, um, sorry, ah, that was many years prior to me becoming involved in uh, native ceremony. Um, then, you know, the years later when I became involved in ceremony, uh, that changed everything. So that actually became my form of meditation. I sort of thought, or I felt that, for at least for me personally, was that it went beyond like the traditional sense of meditation that I was familiar with. I thought it brought something more to it. Um, and I think it helped me personally more to go that route. And that's why I still participate in ceremony on that level through the Ojibwe teachings that I've had throughout my life.
So with those rocks the little people lived in, were they large enough to house like a building, or were they small rocks like boulders?
Well, the idea.
All right, so you're talking about the last question I asked was, were the rocks big? Like, so let's say, was the
Oh
rock
yeah.
like a portal to another world, do you think, or was it an actual house inside the rock? You know what I mean?
All
Like,
right.
because if it was huge rock, like they can hold an amphitheater, or was it just like, do you think it was like a portal zone that goes to another like dimension or reality, like another frequency?
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're getting at. So, from the information that I have learned from stories told about the little people, um, that the rock surfaces are portals into their world. And once you're in the world of the little people, time doesn't exist. So basically, once you enter the realm of the little people, you actually then are, as far as I'm aware, you actually become like the size of the little people and you exist with them. And even though it may seem that you're only in there for like a few minutes or like a day, what happens from the accounts of anybody having ever dealt with the little people and actually gone into their world, that once they come back out, more often than not, um, time in our world, as we conceive of it, has passed uh, in large chunks. So, one of the most prolific stories, or common stories about the little people, is about a man who, while he was canoeing, saw little people in their canoe and decided to follow them. And he followed them all the way back to their homes, which were in the rocks. And then he was actually able to follow them into the rocks. Once he did so, he stayed with the little people for a few days. and he hung out with them and, visited with them. But then he came back out into the real world, right? They said it was so, he wanted to leave, it was time, and he went out back into the world that he knew of, leaving their realm. And when he came back into our realm that we experience, he went back to his village to find his wife and his kids and his relatives. And it turned out that 3 generations had passed. And everybody that he knew of in his immediate family was now dead. And it was only his grandchildren that were alive. And nobody recognized who he was
Yeah,
because he had
because
been, yeah,
I hear these stories repeated in Eskimo culture, Irish culture, all cultures about the Fae or
mhm,
the little people. Um, what do you think? Do you think they're falling in another, like, you know how when people see little people, they always say they seem like they move a little too fast, like they jerk around,
yeah,
like they're off sync with
yep.
our time. Do you think their place is actually timeless, or do you think it flows at a different rate of time than here?
I would have to say I think it probably flows at a different rate because, well, from what I understand about time, the construct that we have, at least in the Western world, of time as being linear is not reality. That's a construct that we have just come up for ourselves to be able to denote the passage of time. When time doesn't really exist, at least in the way that we conceive of it. And I think probably the better explanation of how time functions is on a cyclical level, um, where basically different time streams intersect each other consistently, throughout time as we perceive it. So, um, the little people's time and that they experience from the dimension that they exist in is probably much different than what we experience ourselves. And in certain instances where frequencies were able to be manipulated to the point where someone could enter from our world into their world, as an intersection of those two realms. So where time doesn't move in a linear fashion, as just how space-time functions, in general, like shows that linear time doesn't exist. It's more along the lines of the cyclical, which then everything that is happening right now, that will happen in the future, and has happened in the past, is actually all happening at the same time. And so those things keep intersecting with each other periodically. And I think that we are then able to, every once in a while, be able to intersect with those different time frames and different dimensions.
So we're talking about the ripples on the floor, and I was telling you about examples I heard of reptilians walking through walls and aliens and different types of things doing the same thing. I often hear stories of I even heard of skinwalkers, shamans who came straight out of the ground, and
Oh, yeah.
and little people who jump
Yep.
into the ground like it's a pool, and it just like they're jumping into water, and then it goes somewhere else. And Bigfoot do the same thing. So
Yeah.
if you're able to open a portal with meditation, and you threw a card, and the card didn't go through the floor, but it made the floor ripple like water, and if people could do that, then
Mm-hmm.
if we could figure out the mechanism on how to fall through matter, it doesn't matter if it's stone or wood or anything, does it? It could be any material.
Yep. I would 100% agree with that. I have actually looked into skinwalkers multiple times, as well, because once I started finding out about little people, hearing some stories about them, they then start to lead you in the way, towards the direction of looking into Bigfoot, looking into these other entities that exist, not necessarily within our normal normally perceived realm of existence, but more than likely are passing through between dimensions and through those portals, which those frequencies that I was talking about earlier and with that coil example are ways to engage with those other dimensions. I also do think that, yeah, I do think that like ceremony as well, when you get involved with indigenous, ceremonies, um, all of these ceremonies are constructed in such a manner to also facilitate this type of travel, whether it be physical, mental, whatever it is, whatever you experience during ceremonies. I think it's actually, you're in one way of perception, either physically, mentally, um, you are transported. You have opened a portal and are able to actually go through to at least visualize what's happening on the other side, if not physically pass through.
Yeah, I'm still having trouble understanding how that meditation worked. Like hearing a different frequency, like how does that help your meditation with making it higher? Like, are you building your energy higher per frequency? Like, did the frequency go up and you're like, oh, more intense, or like, how is it? How would the mental aspect work? Because these beings aren't making noise when they travel. Actually, sometimes they are. I hear whistles sometimes when they go through when they go through rock. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Um, the experiment, as the one that I talked about with the coil album and the frequencies, I'd have to say, like, I haven't been able to fully explain that, and how that actually all functions. So, but from what I have witnessed then later on in my life through ceremony, and that frequency is involved because singing, drumming, as someone who participates in Sundance, I've actually been able to, uh, on my fourth Sundance, I did actually pass through, if that's what you could call it. Some of the words I think that we have to describe these events are inadequate for what actually occurs. Not sure if the English language even has words that can really adequately describe this, but the best way I can describe what happened, at least in the Sundance situation, which is something that I was more cognizant and aware of what was happening. But what I found out through my own studies was that ceremonies, especially on the level of Sundance, are oriented based on geometry, concentric circles, energy dispersion, and concentration, by use of drums, singing, dancing, and all of those things are actually part of expressing energy, out into the universe, while actually it all is concentrating as well due to the nature of the ceremony itself. And once a certain level is reached, and that level usually takes the form of a participant, a dancer, piercing their flesh and offering, basically thanks for everything that has sacrificed itself for that individual for that entire year. Um, at least from what I've experienced, once the piercing takes effect and the dancing occurs, and the focus is on one central object within the arbor, that is when the portal opened. I can't, it's hard for me to explain how the portal opens because once it does, time as we know it no longer exists. The world we see no longer exists. Like our perception, um, it's a dulled sound. Like everything around you muffles. You can still hear. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so the reason why I ask you this question, just so you have a little perspective, is because often people describe a quiet when something comes, like a paranormal event. So when you're in the Sundance, things muffle, similar to that, right? Can you describe that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like you go underwater. If you can describe the sound as like you're underwater and the sound that you hear from the outside, from above the surface, like if you're in a pool and there's a lot of kids around and people around and they're running around and you go underwater and the sound that you hear of the people around you outside, that muffled sound. So it's almost like submersing yourself in water. Um, well, you can still perceive what's happening around you. It no longer really seems to matter any longer, or that it's part of your reality.
It's
Does
like you,
that
it's
make
like you
sense?
fall outside of reality a little bit. That's
Yeah.
what it seems like. Like you're,
Um,
because I think it is an actual. I don't think it's ignoring the outside because people who encounter supernatural things often say everything starts to get really quiet, like what you're
yeah.
describing. So I think it's an actual clue on the scientific reasoning behind how all this works.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with that because once you pass over, I mean, it's so similar to being underwater, and then the events that then take place or what you participate in at that point, it almost seems like you're not in control any longer, that your body is working off of just pure like instinct, that it knows what it's supposed to do, whether or not you're actually telling yourself what to do at that point. At least for me, during that experience, what happened was as I was dancing, as I was pierced, I did actually injure myself during the process. I ended up pulling all of the muscles in my right calf, right, to the point of almost tearing them. But while that was occurring, the only thing that happened to me is I heard an audible pop in my like ankle, and then I sort of fell to the ground slightly, but not all the way, because if you did fall all the way, that means that the dance is over. So I got up, kept dancing, despite the fact that I was seriously injured. And I really can't explain how I was able to complete that dance. I completed my rounds of the dance, and once it was finished, the other people that were part of the ceremony relayed to me that while this was happening, and they all witnessed it occur where I injured myself, got up, and kept dancing, they then said that for the remainder of the dance, I had a huge, like, beaming smile on my face. So the only way that I can accurately describe that is that I was not there any longer. The fact that I was injured was not affecting me in any way, shape, or form. I still continued to dance, did not even indicate that I was injured at that point, and kept going. And at that stage is when I, I had already passed over, but was now fully immersed in the experience of being in another place.
Interesting. So, well, did you have any visions or see anything crazy during the Sundance?
Well, my vision is very specific, and it involves a dance. Um, and so the spirit that has told me, or whatever it is, the entity that has told me to dance and shown me the dancing that I'm supposed to do, doesn't actually show up at the dance. It shows up prior to the dance. Um, and I've had it actually appear to me in dreams and appear to me actually like outside of the arbor at the Sundance. Um, this spirit doesn't speak, but the best way that I can describe it as to how it looks and what it does is, are you familiar with kachinas from the Southwest? Okay. All right. Well, kachinas are spirits that are associated with the Hopi tribe. Um, and the spirit that shows up to me that tells me that I'm supposed to dance without actually saying anything um, has a sun mask on. It's a circular mask that looks like the sun and is divided into 3 quadrants. And it has feathers coming out from around the circle. Then, so that's what its face looks like. And then it looks like it has human form, wearing leather leggings, but it also has eagle feathers strapped to its arms. So, and when it shows up in dreams and visions to me, it has expressed itself as just dancing to show me the dance. So when I actually do the dance, it doesn't actually have to show itself. It's almost as if that spirit becomes part of me and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing as far as what the spirit has told me to. Does that make
So
sense?
it's like an instructor?
Yeah.
Huh, that's interesting. And it's interesting that it looks exactly like a Native American mask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the dreams and visions associated with Sundance are very specific and very like vivid. They're not like any other dreams I've ever had in my life. I know I have vivid dreams, but nothing when the dreams come that have to do with the Sundance and ceremony, they are a different caliber of dream. Like they're completely clear and vivid, and like every aspect of the dream is remembered. Like, and certain elders that are part of me being in Sundance and ceremony have shown up in the dreams as well, along with the spirit to instruct me as to what I'm supposed to be doing, which is pretty strange. So, yeah, after those things have occurred, there really is no going back anymore. So, it's and I mean I'm grateful of it that I have been able to see these things. I'm not anybody special, I don't think. It's just that it's happened to work out that way. Yeah, it's the path that I have been on, and it just keeps going, as it goes. I don't try to control it in any way, so it's just sort of led me in these directions over time. I never asked for any of it; it just happens.
That's
So,
awesome, man. So you never seen the little people, but you know from the experiments that it makes sense how they can be living in a rock because the ripple.
yeah. hmm Yeah, from my perspective, scientifically, even though I haven't seen the little people, it makes sense scientifically that it could happen. And enough of the people that I have been in contact with throughout my time involvement with ceremony have spoken of the little people. Um, there's particular landscapes that they will, I guess, are attracted to. And a lot of times they have to do with, spiritual connections that humans have made with certain areas as well. Um, and if things are being done in a good way, it tends to attract little people, at least to visit. And I have that from the elders that I am in contact with, where we do the Sundance grounds, or where our Sundance grounds are in Michigan. The little people have been there
Hmm.
frequently.
What is their view on the
Um,
little people? What do they say about them? Are they mischievous? Are they nice? Are they benevolent? Like, what's their view?
well, overall, they're benevolent, but if they are if they are spoken of in a non-respectful manner, they would cause mischief, and they have caused mischief. But the outlook on little people is you just let the little people do what they're gonna do, and they're not here to hurt anybody. That they can be mischievous, but that's just the way they are. That's the way the little people's way is to be like that, and you just let them do what they do. If you try to interfere with what they do, then it can become problematic. But it's good to have the little people around, so because they can be very helpful as well if they
Like,
choose to be.
like how?
Like, how can they be helpful? Um, as far as I know, a lot of it has to do with exchanging information about, the natural world that we may not actually know. So, like, exchanging of information between two, like, realms, basically.
Yeah, these are people though. They're
Um,
not like spirits, right? Because the way they view them.
yeah, they view them as their actual, like, physical beings that exist. But they have knowledge that we can share with them. They are our brothers. They're just a different being that lives in a different realm.
And the native people said that if we go to their world, we become small like them.
That's what I've heard. If
Hmm.
you are actually able to go into their worlds, then it just is like it becomes like our world for us. It's like we become transformed to their, world.
Hmm.
Um, at least that's what I've heard. Um, and then the people that I know that have seen the little people, they don't talk about the little people. And so there's actually not a whole lot of like conversation about the little people. It's just little bits of information here and there.
Good to straight up
Um,
ask.
huh?
It's good to straight up ask.
Yeah, it is. I mean, people will talk about the little people if you are confront them, but at the same time, people tend to be reticent to
Standoffish.
talk about it because they don't want to offend them at the same time.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, I understand that. Interesting, man. Uh,
yeah. I mean, my son. One little thing. My son, my oldest son, is 16, and he went to Sundance with me once and was acting as a supporter. Really had no real idea of what was going on, about the ceremony. He was learning while he was there, but he swears that he saw the little people while we were there, and I believe him because I don't think he would lie.
did he
He's
describe
also
them?
had paranormal experiences. He described what he saw as shadows that were being cast of little people that were too small to be big people,
Hmm.
and he swears he saw the little people. And at that same night that occurred for him, other people mentioned that they had witnessed little people in the area.
Man, I want to meet the little people. I just don't want to be transported 100 years into the future. That's the only thing I worry about, time being put into the future. Like, oh,
Yeah,
because no one will even know I existed. Like, who the hell are you? I'm like, forget it. Nobody.
exactly. See, that's the rub right there. Is you want to meet the little people and you want to go to their realm, but then what happens as a consequence? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like who knows?
I don't want to go to their realm, but I want to meet them. Because if I go to their realm, I know what will happen.
Yeah,
It's not worth it. because then all my family will be dead,
Yeah.
and it like totally ruined my life.
Yeah. The one main thing that I know, at least as far as attracting little people, is to have there's like having an area in the landscape that is continuously utilized for ceremony. Like
There's,
something that is an area that is continuously utilized for ceremony, there's better chances of little people showing up
you know what I think that has to
to
do with?
observe.
I think that has to do with the
What?
spiritual energy of the land. The more highly charged it is, the
Yeah.
easier it is for interdimensional travel. And then another thing
Exactly.
I found out recently is shamanism works 100 times better in the night with less light than it does in light, because for some reason the electromagnetic frequencies of light are like static interference when it comes to those type of abilities. It messes it up for some reason.
Hmm.
I'm trying to figure out the logic behind that. Like, how would interdimensional travel be affected by electromagnetic frequencies of light? But I don't get it yet.
Hmm.
There has to be a reason, though. Because all these sightings are
Yeah.
always night, 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 night. Little people come out at night, Bigfoot, Dogman, shapeshifters, everything, night, night, night. And then shamans, when they did their magic, they blacked everything out in order for it to work.
Yeah. It's just like the sweat lodge. Everything in the sweat lodge is completely black,
Yep,
you know.
that's
And
how it
I mean,
works.
Sundance happens during the day, but you know, that's almost like here's how we get in to see things for what they are, to reveal it to us, necessarily. But it's weird because it's a ceremony that takes place during the day, and it's not dark.
I think the darkness just makes it easier. But if you have really powerful energy, it could happen in the day.
Yeah. So
But yeah, that's just a thought I have.
yeah, I would agree because it all comes down to energy in the end.
Man,
I think that's really what the key.
you should try to replicate that experiment with the card and see what happens. You should record it. See if you can get the ripples on camera.
Well, I would like to. I have to get a record player again because I have it on vinyl. That's the problem.
I just found it on YouTube, so you can actually listen to it on YouTube.
Yeah. Well, no, I suppose I could because I could just do it with the cards
Mm-hmm.
because I still have the cards as well.
If you
So
get the ripple effect on camera, that'd be pretty amazing. If you have any spiritual
yeah,
friends that would want to
yeah,
help, go.
yeah,
I don't even know if it has to be cards. It probably could be stones or anything.
might be. I do wonder though, because the idea is that it's just it's a portal for your mind, whether or not that like anything would actually be able to record what's happening, like physically. Um, I hope that would be the case. I'd have to try it out again, but I'll have to do it one of these days
Do you think it might have just
and
been
see.
visible spirit with your mind and not physically?
Yeah, I think it might have been. It might be something that's just visible because your mind opens the portal. Um, I'm not sure if you'd actually physically witness it. Like, I mean, you physically do, you see it, but I think you're seeing it with your head. Like your brain is actually being able to transport itself then through the portal. But whether or not other people around you could see what's happening, I'm not sure if that's the case. The only reason I know that it was happening is because me and this guy experienced the same thing. So we both witnessed this event occur, except I don't know if other people that weren't participating would be able to witness it. So I'm not sure, but I'll try it again and see if anything shows up on camera. It might be one of those events that it's not possible for you to participate as an outside like
Hmm.
source. Do you see what I'm
Interesting.
saying?
It might, maybe, but maybe
Yeah.
it also might be visible to everyone. Who knows?
It might be. So it'd have to be. I'd have to do it again and try and record it and see if anything happens. So I wonder actually what the effect of the frequencies might have on digital devices, though. That's the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
If it might have some other strange effects that might get picked up that other than the rippling effect that the individual would see.
Yeah,
So
I hear
curious.
I hear a lot of
Definitely.
battery draining with little people and Bigfoot and everything, and shamanism.
Mm-hmm.
Batteries drain
Yeah.
rapidly, so you might want to have a plugged-in camera.
Yeah. Definitely have it charging the whole time. Oh.
All right,
So is
man.
there anything in particular you want to know? Anything else? Are we good?
Yeah,
Or
that was a good interview. That was really interesting. Got some interesting information. Now I know that portals can exist in solid bodies, like solid rock or ground. It doesn't have to be in thin air or whatever. My
all
friend
right.
saw a little person open a hole on the ground and then jump into it, and then the hole closed behind it. So, like, opened.
From all the weird stuff I've seen over the years now, I'll believe just about anything people say regarding little people or these other beings that are said to move between different dimensions
Yeah,
or worlds.
check out my Green Goblins video. That's where the sighting was. It's the second
Okay.
story, I think. That's one of the guys here in Alaska.
Yeah.
He saw a little person open a hole in the ground and then jump into it, and then the hole snapped shut. So,
Huh. Yeah. I'll definitely check it out.
all right, man. It was nice talking to you. Hopefully, we'll talk again. If you find anything else out, try that experiment out. Let me know how it goes.
For sure. It would be my pleasure.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yep. See ya.
All right. Bye-bye.
Some interesting points I want to go over again. He talks about the rock where they come in and out, so that's the portal location. A lot of times in the missing 411 stories, you'll hear about locations associated with rocks or bodies of water where people go missing. It seems to be that they require objects that can store spiritual energy. Perhaps rocks and bodies of water can store the type of energy required for traveling between realms or worlds. And the experiment that he did with throwing the card on the floor and raising his energy each time seems to be similar to a lot of the stories about interdimensional travel. I've heard stories of reptilians coming into people's rooms, or satyrs, or little people where they'll walk through walls and the wall will ripple like water and then turn back into a solid. The stories you hear of things coming out of the ground, going into the ground, or going into rocks, or dealing with rocks might all be related to the science and reality of how to travel between worlds. And these things seem corporeal or like ghosts, but they may be physical beings that have learned something that we simply don't understand yet. But I intend to get to the bottom of it. Sorry for the long break. I've been exploring a lot. As you can see in the video, that was me during the blood moon. I went from dawn to dusk about 30 miles out in the middle of nowhere and just hiked silently. And I was pretty paranoid about bears. I had my shotgun the whole time. The summertime, I like to adventure a lot and look for the little people, so I'm a little busy. Until next time, people, this is Kitavitoak. Everyone calls me Q, so you can just say Q in the comments. I know my name's complicated.